What do we see? Nothing? An empty void? We might call this space. But what is space? Is it a place, or is it a combination of perceptions? A traffic cone appears, an object used to define an area. Our space has now become activated by its presence. The void is no longer empty. The cone has height, width, and depth. The cone also has a base. Now our emptiness appears to have an up and a down. We do not know how deep our space is, but we know that our space is three-dimensional. We create space by comparing and contrasting relationships. Our space appeared two-dimensional before the cone appeared. The cone's appearance establishes a relationship, a contrast between positive and negative space. The cone is occupying positive space. It is taking up an area in our void, and it gives us an area of focus. The space around the cone, the defined whiteness, can now be considered our negative space. A dichotomy is developed. We observe a relationship between the cone's positive space and the area around the cone, the negative space. As we drift away from the cone, our perception of the negative space increases and our positive space decreases. Even though our view has changed, our cone now appears smaller, a relationship remains. A new space is created. We now appear to be very close to the cone. Our view has changed, so the space has changed. We slowly pan out from the surface of the cone. More negative space appears, as well as a second object, a much smaller sized cone. A new relationship is formed, the relationship of scale. Scale is a tool we use to consider space. It is the size of an object in relationship to other objects and to its surroundings. We now know our original cone is quite small in comparison to our large cone. We now know that our negative space is large enough to hold the two cones. What we don't know is how large our entire space is. A relationship has been formed between the two cones and the negative space. But our negative space is not defined. There are no edges or other reference points. So we cannot yet determine the scale of the objects or the size of the negative space. Our small cone moves in to a more defined location. The negative space has edges, and because we can see the cone sitting on a floor, the space is now delineated. It now has height, width, and depth. Our space is more defined, but we still cannot be certain of the scale of our small cone. The room appears small because we know that the cone we are observing is small in comparison to the large cone. But without another relationship, a known scale reference, we cannot be sure if our cone is a miniature or if our space is gigantic and what we think is a small cone actually towers over us. We need more information before we can determine the size of our object. As the hand appears and removes the cone, we now understand our space. The hand gives us a known scale relationship, a human-sized relationship. The new information provided by the hand allows us to define our space. We have been looking at a miniature cone in a tiny room. Our cone is now at the end of a tight hallway. We now know that our cone is small, but how we perceive space can still affect how the object feels in a room. Our perception determines the spatial presence of an object. With the cone confined at the end of the hallway, it appears to take up the majority of our negative space. Its presence is larger. But with the wall removed, the cone's appearance is suddenly smaller, as it no longer is in a confined space. The cone did not move, but our perception of the space changed by the cone's relationship to the room. We can use these different perceptions to consider the creation of space. Our object's size and scale are determined by its relationships to other objects and its surroundings. But as we discovered, we must have defined areas and scales to understand the size of our objects and the space. We know our cone is in a small room. Its presence occupies most of the space. As our space opens up, however, the cone's presence becomes insignificant to the space we have created. The new space has millions of scale references, millions of different points of view. Each affects the spatial presence of our object. Each changes the perception of the space. Our cone is now surrounded by reference points. We know it is small, but it still has a presence in the space. The cone is in the center of our view, and the color and material creates a contrast between the other materials in the space. The space is created by everything we see, feel, smell, taste. These relationships form even if the object's scale is small. As we pan up and away from our cone, our object no longer plays a role in what we perceive, but we still create space. We just have lost focus. Our cone returns to its void. We know it is insignificant in scale, but it has helped us perceive space. Our cone disappears, but our white void is no longer empty. It is now space.